Starting off at number 34, the worst evolution in the game still is the Evolve Goblin Drill. Most people prefer running the regular Goblin Drill over the evolution so they can use other evolutions inside of their Goblin Drill deck. Ever since they removed the death damage it gets when it respawns, it has just been a lot worse, and it's just typically not going to get much more value than the standard version. The second worst evolution is the Evolved Wizard. Ever since they nerfed the health of its shield, he has just been a lot worse. He doesn't really have great synergy in most decks, which is why there isn't pretty much any deck that he's a requirement in, and pretty much every single evolution is going to be stronger. At number 31, we got the Evolved Electro Dragon. This one fell off a lot because it used to be one of the strongest evolutions, and then they nerfed the amount of chained damage it deals, and it has been a lot worse since then. There's also a lot of solid counters to it in the meta, like the Lightning, for example, and you can pretty much only use it in very specific decks, like with the Golem, for example, which is a pretty weak win condition at the moment, and it's practically useless against cycle decks. Next, we have the Evolved Bomber. When it used to be able to get double bounces on top of units, it used to be significantly stronger, and also when it was a one-cycle evolution. But because those two aspects of the card got nerfed, and it's a two-cycle evolution now, it is significantly worse. You can't even really run it inside of cycle decks anymore, and pretty much the only decks you see it in are in heavy decks occasionally, like E-Giant or Lava Hound, but those decks prefer other evolutions most of the time. This might surprise you guys, but the Evolved Mega Knight is one of the weaker evolutions in the game. I think ever since the Evo Pekka got buffed, which is of course a pretty good counter to the Evo Mega Knight, that made it weaker again. And also there's a lot of scenarios, especially against cycle decks and bait decks, where the Evolved Mega Knight actually isn't giving you any more value than the regular Mega Knight would, so it pretty much is only going to be more valuable against beatdown decks majority of the time. Next is going to be the Evolved Goblin Cage. Definitely a pretty weak building evolution when you have things like the Evolved Tesla, Evolved Cannon, which are just getting a lot more value, and it's very situational. Against air decks, it's practically useless, and also it just has not great synergy in most things. The main decks you're going to see it in is with the Recruits, for example, but a lot of things like Graveyard prefer running the Evolved Cannon over the Evolved Goblin Cage, for example, especially all the cycle decks in the game too. I think the Evolved Mortar is slightly better than the Evolved Goblin Cage, but it's definitely pretty close because after all the nerfs they gave to the Evolved Mortar, it's basically now just a standard mortar that fires a goblin, and with all the solid tanks in the meta, and also ever since things like the Evolved Tesla got buffed and also the Evolved Cannon were added to the game, are pretty solid counters to the Evolved Mortar, definitely making it a below average evolution. The Evolved Barbarians are next. They used to be basically the worst evolution in the game, but they made a little bit of a comeback recently, especially inside of bridge spam decks where they really shine, but also things like Giant Graveyard and Lava Hound, you can make them work, but there's definitely better evolution options in those things, like the Evolved Valkyrie, for example, especially inside of Lava Hound decks. The Evolved Lumberjack took quite a hit ever since they made it a two-cycle evolution. When it was one cycle, it was by far the most broken evolution in the game. Now it's a lot more balanced and a lot weaker, but inside of bridge spam decks, that is where it is very strong, with things like the Battle Ram, for example, or you could make it work if you want to in a Lumberloon freeze deck, but that is pretty off meta, so I would say it is still a below average evolution. And that brings us to the Evolved Battle Ram, another bridge spam type of card. It can be very good in certain scenarios, so it's kind of a situational evolution. If your opponent has something like a building or any sort of reset to it, it can be practically useless, but against a lot of decks that don't have a building, or if you catch your opponent low on elixir or in a bad cycle, it can pretty much take a whole tower by itself and be very difficult to stop, so it really depends on the situation. At number 24, we got the Evolved Pekka. Ever since they buffed the heal per kill a little bit when they overkilled the card, it has made a bit of a return, especially in Goblin Giant Pekka Chef. The Evo Pekka definitely is best in that deck, but you still even see it occasionally with the Evolved Battle Ram too, definitely being a viable evolution option once again. Evolved Musketeer is going to be next. It's no longer one of the worst evolutions in the game ever since they gave it a couple buffs. She is absolutely phenomenal, especially inside of things like Loon Cycle and also Giant Graveyard. Those are going to be the best couple of decks that she's good in. So she's not the most versatile evolution, which I think is the main drawback of her. And also you can block her long shots with things like skeletons and goblins and get a nice prediction, which then makes her ability useless if you get the prediction right. The Evolved Goblin Giant is no longer one of the most broken evolutions in the game after the Chef Tower Troop got a pretty big nerf, which paired so well with it, and also they toned down how frequently it spawns goblins. Ever since they did that, the main time you're seeing the Goblin Giant is with the Pekka, or you might see him from time to time in Sparky, but that is going to be pretty off meta, and with all the buildings in the game like the Evo Tesla and the Evo Cannon, you definitely can stop him pretty easily if you know what you're doing. This is a tiny bit of a prediction and we have to see how the meta plays out, but the Evolved Goblin Barrel is getting a pretty sizable nerf to the decoy damage that the decoy barrel is doing those goblins, which is going to make it significantly worse. But because you're still getting 2 goblin barrels and you have to address both of them, it's still going to be a solid evolution in my opinion, but just a lot more balanced now. And now bait players are probably going to use things like the Evolved Dark Goblin potentially instead of the Evo Barrel, or maybe another baity card and just have the standard Goblin Barrel a bit more often now, but only time will tell. Next is going to be the Evolved Skeletons. I think it's a very average evolution now that there's 3 instead of 4, so you see them occasionally in some cycle decks, maybe things like Loon Cycle or 2.6, but you don't see them in every single cycle deck in the game any longer because there's just a lot of interactions that are different and they're just much more manageable to deal with, but at the same time, they're not completely dead, and if you don't have a small spell in cycle or something to take them out, they can be a really, really big nuisance still. The Evolved Hunter is definitely noticeably worse now ever since they reduced his net duration, and for the most part, he's only viable inside of Royal Giant decks, so even though inside of Royal Giant, it's a very OP synergy in combination with the RG, outside of that, he's not seen a ton, so I can't really put him much higher than this. But when paired with the right cards inside of RG, he can be incredible keeping things in place, and even after the nerf, still a solid evolution without a doubt. Because the Ice Spirit got a freeze duration nerf in the last set of balance changes, this again is a tiny bit of a prediction, but I think it's pretty obvious the Evolved Ice Spirit is no longer going to be one of the best evolutions in the game anymore, but it's not going to be completely dead either, because the fact that you're freezing things twice is still going to be ridiculously broken in some scenarios, but now I think a lot of cycle decks might prefer using other things more often, like maybe the Evolved Skeletons, or maybe things like the Evolved Wall Breakers, or just other Evos instead of the Evolved Ice Spirit every single time. Mid-ladder players absolutely hate this card, but I don't think the Evolved Firecracker is one of the best evolutions in the game, but at the same time, I don't think she's one of the worst either. She can be really annoying, especially inside of Hog decks. Hog EQ is going to be the best Firecracker deck, but also Royal Hogs, you'll sometimes see the Firecracker in as well, especially with the Goblin Hut, but outside of those 2 decks, you don't see her a whole lot because of the King activation potential. That's the main drawback of the Firecracker. You can't really use her inside of something like Graveyard, for example, where you can't deal or afford to have the King Tower activated, so that helps keep her in check a little bit for sure, and also the arrows. At number 16, we have the Evolved Executioner. He's absolutely incredible in the decks that you see him in, like Hog X NATO, for example, or with that Ram Rider Bridge Spam deck. He is incredible. I would say the biggest issue with him is you just simply can't use him inside of a ton of decks because the Executioner is a little bit of a niche card, but against air decks especially, and also beatdown, he absolutely shines. And then sometimes the Evo Executioner against cycle isn't really that valuable, so he's definitely, I would say, an above average evolution, but not one of the most broken ones. The evolved Snowball has made a very large comeback recently. Finally, after giving it a couple buffs, it is finally having success in the meta, especially inside of things like Giant Graveyard, but especially with the Goblin Drill. Guys, with the Goblin Drill, it's a crazy OP combo because you play the Goblin Drill, you play the Evolved Snowball, and basically it pushes everything behind the tower, allowing the goblins to get a ton of damage. So with very specific things, it can be a game-winning evolution, but you can't really pair it inside of every deck in the game. Like Loon Cycle, for example, prefers to run the standard Snowball over the evolution. The Royal Giant is going to be next. You almost always see him with the Evolved Hunter, so commonly these two evolutions are paired together, but sometimes he's used with the Evolved Witch or maybe another evolution. So it's not exactly a requirement, but I think in this meta, especially with additions of the Evolved Inferno Dragon, as well as the Evolved Tesla getting buffed, it has definitely made him a bit worse of an evolution, and he's no longer one of the very best in the game, but he's still very consistent, and RG is something that's pretty much always viable no matter what the meta is. Evolved Royal Recruits, some of people's most hated evolution in the game. They are strong, don't get me wrong, but they definitely have their fair share of counters, especially a lot of cycle cards like the Evolved Cannon, for example, the Evolved Tesla, the Log Splash is going to be viable ways of stopping them, but the way that they're most broken is single elixir. So if you play the recruits first play of the game, and then get to an evolved set of Royal Recruits before it's even double elixir, if your opponent doesn't have the proper rotation, they sometimes can be impossible to stop in a lot of matchups, especially with spammy cards. So it really is dependent on the matchup, but that is why they feel absolutely obnoxious sometimes. Even though they're not one of the most broken evolutions, they're definitely one of the most annoying. Evolved Valkyrie is one of the best evolutions, don't get me wrong, but I just think in most scenarios, the Evolved Knight is going to serve a similar purpose for one less elixir. But the main benefit of the Evolved Valkyrie is, of course, the tornado effect. So the decks that rely most on her for defense purposes, like inside a Lava Hound, for example, that is where she's going to really shine, because you can go in for a Lava Hound in the back and then just go Evolved Valkyrie to defend pretty much the whole push inside of the opposite lane, and it's going to be very, very solid inside of Hog X NATO as well. The Evolved Inferno Dragon has definitely proven to be one of the stronger evolutions in the game, especially inside of beatdown decks. It is a great evolution inside of things like Lava Hound, Giant Graveyard, Graveyard Freeze, so basically heavy decks. And if you don't have a reset for this thing, it often just feels like you're screwed, or you find yourself having to overcommit on it, like having to go for a rocket on top of it just to kill it, for example. So definitely a very annoying evolution if you don't have the proper response, but it's also not going to be super great against cycles, so that's probably the biggest weakness of the card. At number 10, we got the Evolved Witch. She was basically the most broken evolution in the game last month, but because they're nerfing the amount of heals she gets per skeleton, it is without a doubt going to make her worse, and I'm going to assume it's enough to bring her down to around the 10th best evolution in the game. I think this is going to make her less viable inside of cycle decks, because you often saw her in sheep decks, not just beatdown decks, and now this is going to make her probably most effective inside of heavier decks now, so it's going to limit what she's good in. That's my prediction. So inside of things like Graveyard, she's of course going to be very strong still, and maybe even inside of things like Royal Giant, but anything that's maybe like Hog, for example, or Royal Hogs, my prediction is she won't be as good, but only time will tell, and I still think she's going to be very strong. Man, the Evolved Tesla basically went from being one of the worst evolutions in the game to now being debatably one of the best. it is seen in so many different cycle decks, especially Expo being one of the biggest ones. We've seen Expo finish #1 in the world just a couple seasons ago, and a big part of that is thanks to the Evolved Tesla. You can also use it inside of things like Goblin Drill, for example. Maybe you want to use it in a hog deck instead of the Evo cannon, or inside a bait, and that extra pulse damage definitely changing a lot of interactions and making it a lot stronger on defense. At number 8, we got the Evolved Dark Goblin. Usually I rank it a little lower than this, but I think the one big thing that's going to help it out a lot and make it even stronger is the fact that the Evolved Goblin Barrel is getting a nerf, because a lot of people now will probably prefer having the Evolved Dark Goblin instead of the Evolved Goblin Barrel, and also the log nerf is probably going to help it out a tiny bit as well if less people are going to be using the log, because oh my gosh, the amount of damage that the poison does is absolutely absurd, especially if you let it stay on the map for too long. The Evolved Archers have gotten so good recently. Ever since the arrow's radius was nerfed, that is where we have just seen the usage of them go up drastically, especially inside of Expo. That is where they're known for being super OP, of course, but not even only Expo. You have things like Giant Graveyard, for example, that they are going to be very strong in as well. Even some Pekka decks, you'll occasionally see them. And then things like Pump Bow. So there's a couple different decks where they're getting an absurd amount of value, and they just deal so much damage. This is a tiny bit of a prediction because it did literally just come out, but at number 6, we have the Evolved Skeleton Barrel. Guys, the amount of death damage this thing deals is ridiculous. It's dealing more death damage than the regular Skeleton Barrel, and you guys know how you can use the Evolved Wall Breakers on defense. You can use the Evolved Skeleton Barrel defensively, especially if there's an air push coming in. It is dealing so much damage, and it gets a lot of value for only 3 elixir. If you do not have a building in your deck, you are oftentimes going to be screwed when defending this card, because there's just an extra barrel you have to deal with, which, as you can imagine, is going to give you a lot of trouble. Even after the nerf where the radius of the bombs was reduced, the Evolved Cannon still remains to be a top 5 evolution in the game. The thing is just so versatile, especially in just about every single cycle deck in the game, whether it is Log Bait, Royal Hogs, the Goblin Drill, and then it's in some heavier decks as well. Sometimes you'll see it inside of Graveyard or even E-Giant. It's just getting so much value, and it even gets value offensively as well if you have a push coming in, and then maybe you're going for the Evo Cannon, predicting something like a Goblin Gang. Just an absolutely solid evolution in a lot of different decks. At number 4, we got the Evolved Bats. I feel like a lot of mid-ladder players or casuals do not realize how good this evolution is. It might be because maybe it takes a little bit of skill compared to some of the other evolutions, and of course you have to use it in decks where it of course is going to pair well in, but when you're using it inside of a Mortar deck, for example, or a Miner deck, and Miner, I would argue, is the best evolution in the game at the moment. It is insanely strong in those types of decks, especially when paired with things like the Evolved Wall Breakers. You can also use them with the Mega Knight, for example, as well, some off-meta decks, and they just get a ridiculous amount of value, especially if it's even just baiting out spells, and then you can use another baity card in your deck. They're just getting a lot of value. Top 3, we now have the Evolved Zap. This is basically the evolution of choice for majority of the beatdown decks in the game. Whether it is Giant, Lava Hound, Pekka, you are commonly seeing this evolution to allow you to break through buildings, whether it's something like an Inferno Tower or just as a stun for something like the Evolved Inferno Dragon. Also, some crazy interactions with the Evolved Zap is it can kill other strong evolutions by itself. For example, the Evolved Zap is able to kill things like the Evolved Archers, the Evolved Firecracker, so it's basically another counter to those other strong evolutions, and it just gets a lot of value, especially in heavier decks. You can't really run it in cycle, though. At number 2, we got the Evolved Knight. Even after all the nerfs this card has gotten, it is just so versatile and consistent in a large variety of decks and archetypes for that matter. So we could start with Cycle. He, of course, is going to be very good inside of Hog, if you want to use him in a Hog deck, in a Goblin Drill deck, in Expo, but then heavier decks he's going to be good in. Maybe you want to run him inside of a Bridge Spam deck, maybe a Graveyard deck. He is just staying alive for such a long time, a very, very solid tank, and he just remains to be the best choice oftentimes in a lot of different decks, which is why I have him higher than the Evolved Valkyrie, because for one less elixir, he's just a more consistent tank most of the time. At number 1, guys, in my opinion, this is the strongest evolution in the game, and I think the end of last season has proved it. So many people at the top of ladder were running minor evolved wall breakers. It just felt like it was everywhere. They're just doing a ridiculous amount of damage for only 2 elixir, and not even are they good only on offense. Defensively, if you have a big push coming in, a bunch of things together, you can just go for your evolved wall breakers. It's going to blow up and deal a ton of damage on defense, helping you defend too. So there's a couple different ways you can use them. And not even just inside of a minor poison deck, for example. You can use the minor Magic Archer Tornado deck, which the Evolved Wall Breakers pair very well in. Recruits, Evolve Wall Breakers, one of the most broken combinations in the game as well. You can use them with things like the Mega Knight too, and they just are very, very challenging to stop unless you have a building or you have the specific response and cycle like maybe an Ice Spirit and a Log, but they definitely are going to be a nuisance regardless because you're going to see them multiple times throughout the match, especially because they're such a cheap evolution. If you guys enjoyed the video, be sure to give it a like and subscribe if you guys are not subscribed already. You can use creator code BOSS to support me in any Supercell game. Let me know in the comments below what you guys would change about this list, and thanks again until next time, guys.